Hello everybody, good evening and welcome to your very own BYJU'S 6th, 7th and 8th grade channel. I'm your teacher Aishwarya and I welcome you to this video where we are going to be summarizing the chapter Reproduction in Animals, that too in under 30 minutes. Now, in case if you want a detailed chapter explanation, the link to the one shot is available in the description of this video. You can watch that video for a detailed chapter explanation. But in this video, we will quickly revise all the important concepts from this particular chapter. So I recommend that you have your notebooks and your textbooks ready so that it will help you in your revision. And of course, very importantly, at the end of this video, in the description, you will find a link to a Google form where we have some interesting questions for all of you to solve. So go ahead and solve those questions post this revision. So without wasting any more time, students, we will get started. Now, as you know, the name of the chapter here suggests it is reproduction in animals. So what do we mean by the term reproduction? Now, reproduction can be simply defined as the process by which living organisms produce young ones of their own kind. Now, these are the two keywords that we will look at in this particular definition of reproduction. That means that we have adult living organisms that have the ability to give rise to young ones or young babies, or another word that we will use is offsprings of their own kind, which means that if we have dogs, they will give rise to puppies or younger dogs, which will eventually grow into a new organism or an adult dog, right? Similarly, if we have cats, they will give rise to kittens, which will eventually grow and become adult cats. So in all these cases, we see that they are producing young ones of their own kind. Now, what is the reason for doing or performing this process of reproduction? Will a living organism die if it does not reproduce? As a matter of fact, let's understand this with an example. Now, if you look at, let's say 200, 300 years ago, and if I were to ask you, do you think mangoes would have existed back then? 200, 300 years back, right? Probably yes, we would have found mango trees. Now, cut to 2024, and if I were to ask you, do we find mango trees? You would say yes. But does this mean that the same mango tree was available way back then and now? No, right? Because we know that every living organism has a fixed lifespan. What is a lifespan? A lifespan is a period between birth to death. And every living organism has a fixed lifespan, which means eventually this mango tree is bound to complete its lifespan and no longer exist or die. But when this mango tree maybe, let's say, produces seeds, and each seed maybe grows and it becomes a new mango tree, it will further produce mangoes, right? And the cycle continues. So thereby what happens? This process of seed production or giving rise to young ones, all of this here ensures that there is continuity of species. But let's say a mango tree does not produce any mangoes, right? Eventually, it will go on to complete its particular lifespan and eventually we see that it will die. And in such cases, what will happen? We see that if it does not produce a young one, eventually on the long run, if plants do not reproduce or if, let's say, living organisms do not reproduce, then we will see that they will no longer be there on the face of the earth or they will be extinct. Which is why what is the importance of reproduction or what is the significance? They ensure the continuity of species and they protect it from extinction. So which is why we see that reproduction is a very important process. Now, based on this, we see that there are two modes of reproduction. We have a sexual mode of reproduction and sexual mode. Now, in asexual mode of reproduction, what do we observe? We see that in asexual mode, we see that there is only one parent involved. While in the case of sexual reproduction, there are two parents which are involved, namely a male and a female parent. Now we see that when male and female parents are involved, they come together and give rise to an offspring. And the offspring that they produce will be similar to the parent but not identical. While on the other hand, if you look at asexual reproduction, we see that there is only one parent And this one parent will undergo various changes within its body and give rise to a young one. And this young one will end up looking identical to that parent, right? Because within its body only it is undergoing various changes and giving rise to it. So these are two main points of difference that we see between asexual mode and sexual mode. Now, one more point of difference that we observe is that when I say male and females are involved, we see that they produce certain specialized cells that get involved in reproduction. And these specialized cells are called as reproductive cells, or we may call them as sex cells or gametes. So in the case of sexual reproduction, gametes are involved. While in the case of asexual reproduction, gametes are not involved. They don't produce any specialized cell. Now, this point of difference between asexual mode and sexual mode is very, very important, and it is a 3-mark question that they can ask you in the examination. So based on this, let's explore the different types that we observe. So let's look at the different types of asexual reproduction that we see. Now, first up, we have binary fission, which is often seen in amoeba, wherein we see that there is an adult amoeba, which we call as the parent amoeba or the parent cell. And we see that this amoeba will undergo various changes within its body, such that it will split and it will give rise to 2 daughter cells. Now, when I say it will split, it's not that the parent amoeba will split into half, but rather whatever is there within its body, right? All the genetic material, all the cytoplasmic content, everything it will duplicate. It will create a copy. And once it creates that copy, it will then split into 2 daughter cells such that it is identical. So this kind of asexual reproduction where one parent is splitting and giving rise to 2 daughter cells, we call this as binary fission. So the key word here is splitting. Now, on the other hand, in organisms like Hydra and in the case of yeast, we see that there is another type of asexual reproduction that takes place, which is called as budding. Now, in the parent plant, in the parent organism, in the case of parent Hydra, we see that there is a small outgrowth, right? Which means that when I say outgrowth, it grows outside the parent body, yes? So we see that it forms a mass of cells like this. Now, this small outgrowth is what we call as a bud. Now, this bud will start to grow, it will start to develop and mature. Now, as it grows, develops and mature, it will start to look more and more like the parent. And eventually, it will break off from the parent and become a new organism. So, this kind of asexual reproduction where there is formation of an outgrowth, which we call as a bud, which eventually develops and matures into a young one, is what we call as budding, which is seen in organisms like Hydra and yeast. So these are the 2 kinds of asexual mode of reproduction that is there mentioned in the NCERT. Now let's move on to sexual reproduction. Now, as discussed in sexual reproduction, we know that there are 2 parents which are involved. So we see that there is a male and a female. And we know that these male and female, they come together and they give rise to a young one or an offspring. Now, when I say that they are the ones coming together, which we see that the male produces a male reproductive cell or a male gamete, and we know that the female will produce a female gamete or a female reproductive cell. And these male and female gametes are the ones which come together and they are the ones which will eventually give rise to the offspring. So the next question is, where is the male and female gamete present or where are they produced? So let's understand this with the help of the human body because sexual reproduction is seen in human beings as well. So if you see in the human body, there are specialized structures called as reproductive system. And this reproductive system is what is responsible for the production of gametes and also which facilitate the process of reproduction to happen. So in the male body, we have the male reproductive system and in the female body, we have the female reproductive system. So first up, let us have a look at the male reproductive system. Now, in the case of the male reproductive system, we see that the main reproductive organ, right? The main reproductive organ, let me write that down, is called as the testis. Now, we see that the testis that is there is present The testis that is there is present outside the male body. We say that it is extra abdominal, and it is found protected by a sac-like structure called as scrotum. And we see that inside the testis is where the male gamete or the sperm is produced. So here in this case, what do we observe? We see that the sperms are produced in the testis. From here, it goes on to the next part, which is called as the epididymis. Now, this of course is not there in your syllabus, but I'm just mentioning it to you. So, the epididymis is a structure that is present close to the testis. And from here, we see that the sperms travel through the sperm duct or the vas deferens. It loops over the urinary bladder and then joins the urethra. Now, the urethra here, we see that it then enters into the male external genitalia called as the penis. And we see that at this particular part, right, at this particular portion, the sperms also receive a lot of secretions from glands like seminal vesicle, prostate gland, and Cowper's gland. So, these glands are called as accessory glands. So, we see that secretions from accessory glands along with sperms result in the formation of semen. And we see that this semen is a milky whitish fluid that is ejaculated out from the male external genitalia, which is the penis. Now here, of course, understanding the structure of the sperm is also very important. So if you look at it, the sperm looks something like this, where it has three regions. It has the head, middle piece, and tail, which is the male reproductive gamete, which is the male gamete, right? Now it is very small in size, and we see that the head here has the nucleus that consists of the genetic material. And this genetic material has all the information that is needed to be passed on from parent to offspring. Now we also see that there is a middle piece which generates a lot of energy and a tail that helps the sperm swim. Now why is it necessary for the sperms to swim? That is because we see that once the male gamete is produced inside the male body, this male gamete now needs to enter the female body, right? Which is why we see that the sperms are released into the female body, and we see that inside the female body it needs to swim. That is where these tails come into the picture. So now let's understand what is the structure of the female reproductive system and what happens from here. Now the female reproductive system, we see that the main reproductive organ is the ovary. So these are the main reproductive organ which produces the female gamete that is called as the egg or the ovum. Now if I were to use the plural of it, it is called as ova. Right? Now we see that there are a pair of ovaries inside the female body. And mind you, it's something I forgot to mention earlier. In males also we see that there are a pair of testes. Not a single one, but a pair of testes. Now we see that apart from the ovary, the other structures in the female reproductive system include the oviduct or a fallopian tube, and we see that there are a pair of them. We have a pear-shaped muscular organ which is the uterus, and of course we see that there's the birth canal called as the cervix and the vagina. Now the vagina here is the female external genitalia, and we see that the sperms here are released into the female reproductive system through the vagina. Now once it enters into the female reproductive system, the sperms will swim up, and they will swim up through the uterus, and they will reach all the way to the fallopian tube. Now along the same time, let's say if the egg is released by the ovary. When the egg is released by the ovary, we see that the egg is the female gamete, right? And we see that this right here has the cytoplasm, and it has a nucleus that has all the genetic information. So in this case, we see that the sperms that are there, once released, and that was not one sperm. We see that millions and millions of sperms will get released into the female reproductive tract. And when the egg gets released, we see that the sperms and the egg meet. And if they meet at the fallopian tube, right? So if they meet at the fallopian tube, we see that the male and the female gamete will fuse. So here what do we see? We see that the sperms and the egg fuse, resulting in the formation of a single cell structure called as zygote. And this process of fusion is what we call as fertilization. And when I say they fuse, it means that the nucleus, right? So if you look at it, we see that nucleus from the sperm and the egg fuse, forming a single nucleus inside a single cell structure called as the zygote. Now, where has this zygote formed? The zygote has formed inside the oviduct, or it has formed inside the fallopian tube. Now, how will the zygote develop further in the female body? Now, this zygote here will undergo series of division, right? Now, like I said, zygote is a single cell. So now it will start to divide, forming 2 cells, then a clump of 4 cells, then a clump of 8 cells, then a clump of 16 cells, right? So it will keep becoming bigger and bigger in size, and it will keep growing in number. But if you look at it, we see that now it's just a ball of cells, right? At this point, we see that it is just a ball of cells. Now, once it forms a ball of cells, we see that these cells are not specialized in any way. They're just a group of cells. They're not specific in function or nature. But eventually we see that these cells will then group together and form different tissues. So they will end up forming different tissues, different organs. Now this structure or this developing structure is what we call as an embryo. So what is an embryo? An embryo is a group or a multicellular stage of development where we see that we observe different types of tissues being formed, right? And this embryo is what will then get implanted into the wall of the uterus. Now the uterus, we see that is a pear-shaped organ, and the inner lining of the uterus has thickenings of blood and mucus. This is done so that it can receive the fertilized egg. And by the time the zygote travels from the oviduct to the uterus, it has formed into a structure called as the embryo that will implant, or it will embed itself onto the wall. And this process of embedding onto the inner linings of the uterus is what we call as implantation. Now this is done so that now it can derive more and more nutrition from the mother for development. And inside the mother's body, it will start to develop and it will undergo various stages of development. Now eventually, there are different tissues which are being formed. Now from here, it will gradually develop parts like the hands, the legs, head, eyes, ears, all of those parts. Now this stage of development where we can observe the limbs and different parts of the body, we call this as the fetus. So these are the main points of difference between the embryo and the fetus. Now as the embryo starts to develop, right? So as the embryo here starts to develop, we see that it takes about a total of 9 months for the embryo to develop the fetus to develop, right? So it takes about 9 months for the fetus to develop, and once it has achieved complete development within the mother's body, we see that it is then given birth, or the mother will give birth to the young one. So such kind of animals which give birth to their young ones, we call them as viviparous animals. So human beings, dogs, cats, elephants are all examples of viviparous animals. But on the other hand, if you see animals like birds or like hens, right? We see that once the zygote is formed, we see that development does not happen within the mother's body. But rather we see that the zygote will travel down the oviduct, and as it travels through the oviduct, we see that many protective layers get formed around the zygote. So if this is my zygote, we see that there are various protective layers that get added around the zygote. And eventually we see that it forms a hard shell, right? So we see that it eventually forms a hard shell, and this particular hard shell encloses the developing embryo. So here we see that development of the embryo is taking place inside a shell and not inside the mother's body. And we see that this development of embryo totally takes about 3 weeks or so to happen, and it requires sufficient warmth, which is why the mother is normally found sitting on these eggs. And eventually, once development is complete, the eggs will crack open. So such kind of animals who lay eggs and the young ones develop inside the egg, we call them as oviparous animals. So based on development, we can categorize animals as viviparous and oviparous animals. Now, on the other hand, we saw that in this particular case of human beings, the process of fusion happened inside the female body. But does this mean that it will always happen inside the female body? As a matter of fact, no. Fertilization can either happen internally or it can happen externally. Now, internal fertilization is when it takes place inside the female body. So, normally in the case of, let's say, animals like, hens, in the case of human beings, let's take most terrestrial animals, we see that internal fertilization or fusion of male and female gamete happens within the mother's body. While on the other hand, in the case of aquatic animals like fishes, frogs, what they do is they release the gametes into water, right? So they release a large number of eggs and a large number of sperms into the water. And we see that fusion happens outside the female body or it is external. So in such cases, in the case of external fertilization, we see that the eggs that are there are quite different. So just to go a little bit ahead, right? We see that the eggs are not like in the case of the hen's egg, which is very hard. But rather we see that they are slightly softer and they're held together by a jelly that provides them protection. And we see that the eggs which get exposed at times might get fed by other fishes. But nonetheless, we see that that is the reason why large number of gametes are produced. So that large number of eggs are there and higher the possibility of survival. So this is one thing to remember with respect to external fertilization. Now, like I said, frogs is an example of the same, right? Now, in the case of frogs, we see that once the eggs are fertilized, we see that they will develop into tadpole. Then we see, which is normally found underwater. Then it will undergo a drastic change within its body such that it will become an adult frog. So this what we observe. This phenomenon in the life cycle of frogs, in the case of silk moths, in all these cases, from when they are at their larval stage to the adult stage, we see that there is a drastic transformation. And this drastic transformation that takes place is called as metamorphosis. So metamorphosis is the process wherein there is a drastic transformation from larvae to an adult. So with this, everybody, if you see, we come to the end of this particular chapter. Now, I did dwell with some of the concepts in slightly greater detail, but I now hope that you found this chapter easy. And here is a quick summary of the entire chapter. So this is a homework question for all of you, which I want you to let me know in the comments of this video, where you need to differentiate between oviparous and viviparous organisms and give me an example. So I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, don't forget to let me know in the comments. And as you know, BYJU'S 6th, 7th and 8th grade channel has always got you covered. Hoping to see you all very soon again. Up until then, take care, lots of love and bye-bye.